The haunting began in August 1977 in the small, unassuming town of Enfield, a suburb of London. The location of the Hodgson family's home was a relatively standard council house, part of the growing post-war housing developments in England. The house was built with typical suburban construction, but would soon become infamous as one of the most haunted homes in history. The house at 284 Green Street was a modest two-story dwelling where the Hodgson family, consisting of Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children, including Janet and Margaret, moved into after experiencing financial difficulties. The home was like any other, except for the inexplicable and disturbing events that would soon engulf their daily lives. The family had no history of supernatural experiences before moving there, which made the phenomena that soon followed all the more terrifying. The hauntings began with simple sounds, banging, knocking, and rattling noises, but quickly escalated into something much darker. The location's role in this haunting case is crucial. Many investigators and skeptics have looked at the geographical factors, including the possibility of underground water or other environmental elements that could explain the sounds and occurrences. However, nothing scientifically conclusive has ever been proven to explain the series of events. While some skeptics suggest the possibility of a hoax or psychological phenomena, the sheer volume of reports from multiple witnesses, including police officers and investigators, lends credence to the idea that something truly inexplicable occurred in that house. The house itself, now an infamous site in paranormal history, has been the subject of many investigations, documentaries, and even a Hollywood film. Today, the house still stands, though it has been sold to different owners, none of whom have reported any continuing activity. The haunting remains one of the most well-documented cases of poltergeist activity in the world, with its location becoming a permanent fixture in paranormal studies. The Hodgson family consisted of Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children, Janet, Margaret, Johnny, and Billy. At the time of the haunting, Peggy was a single mother raising her children in a modest home. Janet and Margaret, aged 11 and 13 respectively, were the primary targets of the disturbances, though the entire family was affected by the activity. Janet, in particular, became the focus of the poltergeist's violent outbursts. She would often be seen levitating, thrown across the room, and experiencing physical attacks. These manifestations made her the subject of intense media scrutiny, but they also caused tremendous stress for the entire family. The family had no prior knowledge or history of paranormal experiences, and they initially struggled to understand the increasingly bizarre phenomena occurring around them. Peggy, their mother, was understandably distraught. She called the police, believing that someone was playing pranks on her family. However, when the officers arrived and witnessed the events firsthand, they were left shaken and unable to offer any explanation. Police were reportedly witness to a chair moving across the floor on its own, and some of them even left the house fearing they were witnessing something they couldn't comprehend. Despite the family's turmoil, the Hodgsons maintained a relatively low profile at first, not seeking attention from the media. However, as the activity continued to escalate, they sought help from local paranormal investigators and were eventually contacted by the famous paranormal researchers, Maurice Grosse and Graham Morris, who became central figures in documenting the haunting. Through it all, the Hodgson family, particularly Janet, was subjected to intense physical and emotional strain. The involvement of the Warrens added a layer of tension to the case, particularly when their interpretation of the events as a demonic infestation contradicted some of the local investigators' theories. Janet's experiences in particular would go on to be among the most disturbing in the history of poltergeist activity. The family's testimony remains one of the cornerstones of the Enfield haunting case, leaving an indelible mark on paranormal lore. The first signs of unusual activity in the Hodgson household were subtle, with the family initially believing they were hearing random knocks and bumps. These phenomena included knocking on the walls, odd sounds coming from the ceilings, and furniture shifting. At first, the family thought perhaps something was loose, but the noises were so persistent and irregular that they soon realized they were dealing with something far stranger. It wasn't long before these sounds grew louder and more frequent. The knocking often sounded like it came from within the walls or floors of the home, with no visible source. Sometimes it sounded like furniture or objects were being dragged or shifted. The intensity of the noises grew, and the family's fear intensified. At one point, a piece of furniture, a large armchair, moved across the living room floor on its own, witnessed by Peggy, her children, and even police officers who were called to investigate. The movement was so noticeable that multiple witnesses, including skeptics, couldn't deny something extraordinary was happening. The local police officers were especially stunned, one of whom reportedly said, "I've been in this job 10 years and I've never seen anything like this before." The noises and disturbances continued for weeks before more violent manifestations began to emerge. The family reported the sounds of items being thrown across rooms and strange objects shifting without explanation. It was clear that whatever was in the house had an intelligence behind it. The movement of furniture, combined with loud banging and knocking sounds, became a constant reminder to the family that something terrifying was happening. These early experiences were only the beginning. As the activity intensified, the poltergeist seemed to target Janet directly, especially through physical manifestations. The sounds alone were unsettling, but as the family's fear mounted, more aggressive and frightening events unfolded, pushing the Hodgsons to call for professional help. As the poltergeist activity intensified, Janet quickly became the focal point of the haunting. The young girl, only 11 years old at the time, began experiencing the most terrifying manifestations. One night, Janet was in bed when, without warning, she was violently thrown from the bed by an unseen force. This wasn't a small, gentle nudge. She was slammed onto the floor with force as though something had picked her up and tossed her. This physical assault on Janet wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next several weeks, the phenomena surrounding her became increasingly more violent. Janet would often be seen being levitated in midair. Several witnesses, including her mother, police officers, and paranormal investigators reported seeing her body floating several inches above the ground. She wasn't moving on her own. She was being lifted by something invisible. But the most disturbing part was that Janet wasn't in control. She would scream in terror as her body was seemingly manipulated by a malevolent force. She appeared to be unconscious, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape from. In these moments, it seemed like something was taking hold of her, controlling her every movement. One investigator, Maurice Gross, was even physically present when this happened and described feeling an overwhelming sense of fear. As the levitations grew more frequent, it became clear that something dark and powerful was targeting Janet. The family, already terrified by the unexplained phenomena, was now worried for her safety. She wasn't just a passive witness to these events. She was a victim of something far more sinister. The physical attacks against Janet intensified, with marks appearing on her body that couldn't be explained. Scratches, bruises, and even bite marks were found on her skin, all seemingly inflicted by an invisible hand. At one point, Janet was heard speaking in a deep guttural voice, one that didn't sound like her own at all. When investigators asked her who was speaking, the voice replied, "I am Bill. I'm the one who haunts this place." The voice was harsh and menacing, nothing like Janet's soft, childlike tone. The voice spoke with a distinct accent, and it became apparent that it wasn't coming from Janet at all, but from something else entirely. It wasn't just the family who experienced these horrors. Neighbors reported hearing loud, unexplained noises coming from the house at all hours of the night. Some of them even claimed to have seen dark, shadowy figures moving around the windows, figures that couldn't have been there. The tension in the house was unbearable, and no one could explain why it was happening. What was it that wanted Janet? What dark force was haunting this innocent child? If the strange knocking and banging weren't enough, things took an even darker turn when Janet herself started to defy gravity. On multiple occasions, witnesses, including paranormal investigators, police officers, and neighbors, reported seeing her levitate. She wasn't just floating gently, she was being thrown through the air, almost like a puppet controlled by an invisible hand. In one particularly harrowing event, Janet was seen floating off her bed, rising several feet into the air before being thrown across the room. Those who witnessed it were left speechless, unable to explain the impossible sight they had just seen. The levitation wasn't limited to Janet. In some instances, pieces of furniture, including chairs, were seen moving across the floor on their own. The most chilling moment involved a heavy armchair that appeared to glide from one side of the room to the other without anyone touching it. Witnesses claimed the chair was gliding as if being pulled by some unseen force, leaving no traces of any wires or strings. At one point, investigators began to film the activity, hoping to catch some concrete evidence of the supernatural events. The footage was shocking. Objects seemed to move on their own, doors slammed shut, and unseen forces tossed around items at will. But what was most disturbing was the way Janet was thrown from her bed in a seemingly unnatural way, landing with a sickening thud on the floor. The levitation and furniture movement were so violent that it became clear this was not an ordinary haunting. The family wasn't just dealing with a mischievous spirit. They were being tormented by something far more powerful. But what did it want? Why was it focused on Janet? Was it trying to hurt her, or was it simply demonstrating its power? The answers remained elusive, and the family was left trapped in a nightmare that they couldn't wake up from. Among the most chilling aspects of the Enfield poltergeist case was the voices that emerged from Janet during the haunting. As if levitation and physical assaults weren't disturbing enough, the entity haunting the house also began to speak. But the voice didn't sound like Janet at all. It was deep, guttural, and full of menace. It seemed to mock the investigators, mocking their attempts to help the family. One of the voices that spoke through Janet called itself Bill. According to the entity, Bill was a former tenant who had died in the house many years before. But there was one major issue. No one in the area knew of any Bill who had ever lived there. The voice, however, seemed to know intimate details about the house and its history. It knew things no one could have possibly known, further fueling the fear that this wasn't just a trick or a hoax. This voice, this Bill, had a knowledge of the house that seemed supernatural. As the voice spoke through Janet, it began to display its power. It would communicate in a harsh, threatening manner, often cursing or making cryptic statements. Some investigators described hearing the voice laugh, an eerie, sinister laugh that seemed to echo through the house. The voice was never consistent. It changed its tone, sometimes sounding like an old man, sometimes like a child, and other times it sounded downright demonic. The voice was so compelling that it drew the attention of local media and investigators from around the world. But it also left everyone with a sense of dread. Who was this Bill? Was it the spirit of a former resident or something much darker? The fact that Bill spoke with such confidence and authority only deepened the mystery. And more importantly, what did it want? The suspense and fear continued to build for the Hodgson family as the events grew darker, more violent, and more unexplainable. The line between reality and the supernatural blurred. leaving everyone involved wondering if they would ever escape the grip of the Enfield poltergeist. Would the Warrens and investigators find a way to stop the haunting? Or would the family be trapped in the grip of an ancient evil forever? The tension remained high, and the answer would come at a terrifying cost. As the intensity of the haunting escalated, the Hodgson family realized they couldn't handle it alone. Desperate for help, they reached out to Maurice Gross and Graham Morris, two paranormal investigators with years of experience. They were part of the Society for Psychical Research, an organization dedicated to studying unexplained phenomena. Upon arriving at the house, the investigators were struck by the overwhelming feeling of unease that seemed to hang in the air. The house felt heavy, like something oppressive was present. As they began their investigation, they witnessed things they couldn't easily explain. The family was already visibly exhausted, emotionally and physically drained by the constant attacks, and the investigators could see that this wasn't just a case of overactive imaginations. One of the most terrifying moments for the investigators occurred when they set up cameras to record the strange occurrences. They hoped to capture something tangible, something undeniable. But what they witnessed was more than they bargained for. In one instance, they watched as Janet was thrown across the room, her body moving with unnatural speed and force. The team immediately knew this was no hoax, it was something much darker. Gross and Morris were also subjected to unsettling experiences. On one occasion, they claimed to hear voices coming from the walls, a constant whispering that seemed to be speaking directly to them, though no one was there. In some instances, they could feel cold spots and a sense of dread that would overcome them, as if an unseen force was deliberately trying to intimidate them into leaving. Despite all this, Gross remained committed to helping the Hodgson family. The strange thing about this haunting was that the entity seemed to focus all its attention on Janet. It was almost as if it had singled her out for some twisted purpose. While other family members, though affected, didn't experience the same intensity of phenomena. As the investigation wore on, it became clear that this was no ordinary poltergeist. It was powerful, intelligent, and malevolent. But no matter how hard they tried, Gross and Morris couldn't seem to communicate with the entity directly. They were faced with a terrifying unknown, and the more they delved into it, the more they realized they were in over their heads. As the haunting persisted, the case attracted the attention of the famous American paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were known for their involvement in several high-profile paranormal investigations, including the Amityville Horror. They were called to the scene in 1978 by Maurice Gross and Graham Morris after they had become convinced that the Hodgson family was dealing with something far more sinister than a regular poltergeist. The Warrens, upon entering the house, immediately felt an overwhelming sense of danger. Lorraine, who was a self-proclaimed clairvoyant, claimed to sense a strong demonic presence in the house, something darker and more malicious than the usual restless spirits that they often encountered. She believed the entity was not simply a ghost or a poltergeist, but a demonic force that had latched onto Janet. Ed, who was an experienced demonologist, suggested that the only way to rid the family of the entity would be through an exorcism. The Warrens believed the entity was attempting to possess Janet and possibly the entire family, feeding off their fear and distress. However, their methods were met with skepticism by many, as the Warrens were often controversial figures in the paranormal community. The Warrens' involvement added a layer of tension to the case. Many local investigators were skeptical of their claims, accusing the Warrens of sensationalizing the case for publicity. However, their theories about the demonic nature of the haunting aligned with what Gross and Morris had observed. Together, they documented numerous incidents of poltergeist activity, from objects being thrown across rooms to the disturbing sounds of footsteps and knocking coming from the walls. For the family, The presence of the Warrens was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they brought attention to their plight and provided a sense of validation. On the other hand, the heightened scrutiny and public attention only added to the strain they were already experiencing. The stakes were now higher. If the Warrens were right, the Hodgsons weren't just dealing with an angry spirit. They were being attacked by something far worse. The involvement of the Warrens in the Enfield poltergeist case helped cement its place in paranormal history, but it also created divisions. Some believed the Warrens had exaggerated their role, while others remained convinced that they were dealing with something truly demonic. But one thing remained certain: the fear, tension, and mystery surrounding the case continued to grow, leaving everyone wondering if anyone could stop it. As the story of the Enfield poltergeist spread, so did the skepticism. Not everyone believed that the Hodgson family was experiencing a genuine supernatural phenomenon. In fact, there were many who claimed the haunting was a carefully orchestrated hoax, a deliberate attempt to deceive the public and garner media attention. Some of the key skeptics pointed to Janet, suggesting that she might have been fabricating the levitation and strange behavior as a way to get attention. Janet's age, 11, at the time, made her an easy target for accusations of mischievousness. Critics claimed that she was acting out, creating these disturbances in order to manipulate the adults around her, including the investigators who had entered the house. However, many who witnessed the events firsthand, especially the paranormal, investigators and police officers, were adamant that they were not being deceived. Maurice Gross, one of the lead investigators, famously said, "We were not duped. We saw it with our own eyes." Gross had seen enough to know that this wasn't just a child's trick or an overactive imagination. Yet others pointed to the possibility of psychological factors at play. Some argued that the family's intense stress combined with the media circus surrounding the case could have led to mass hysteria or shared delusions. It was also suggested that the family might have exaggerated the events for financial gain, as the media attention surrounding the case was immense, with many reporters flocking to Enfield to cover the unfolding drama. Despite these accusations, the Enfield poltergeist case remains one of the most well-documented paranormal occurrences, with numerous witnesses and recorded evidence supporting the idea that something truly unexplainable took place. Whether it was a genuine haunting or an elaborate hoax, the mystery surrounding the case continues to captivate those who hear